Hey everybody, Marcus here. So today I want to talk about a subject that I've been kind of thinking about for a good solid year now. It's about shame. And I came up with this concept that I think is very useful in explaining people's behavior in general. I call it the hourglass of shame. Now, shame is an interesting emotion because I would say that is probably the most powerful emotion that the human being actually possesses. It's more powerful than fear. It's more powerful even than the will to live. After all, people that kill themselves tend to do it because of a deeply rooted shame. And shame also has a very strong biblical connotation because within the story of Adam and Eve, one of the first things that happens after God discovers that, well, Adam and Eve had violated his rule of eating from the tree of good and evil is that Adam hid himself because he was ashamed. And I think part of the story of Adam and Eve is really highlighting the centrality of the emotion. I guess emotion might not be the right word, but the very phenomenon of shame itself. Now, the reason I don't really think that shame can be considered an emotion in the same sense of, say, something like fear is because you can actually embody shame in a much deeper way than you embody fear. So there are people who can feel ashamed because they've performed some sort of shameful act, something that is beneath them. But then there's others who don't necessarily feel the emotion of shame, but embody shame itself. That shame is so ingrained into who they are that they no longer suffer from these bouts of shame based on doing something shameful. In fact, a lot of people who are embodied with shame don't actually feel the emotion of shame on any regular basis. Now, this concept of the hourglass of shame that I want to really kind of flesh out here. It works kind of like this. So an hourglass has a wide base, a triangular wide base. It meets at the middle and then it expands outwards. Well, two pyramids basically inverted via a mirror image. And the embodiment of shame occurs from a multitude of sources. It seems to me that there's no necessarily one common cause that can cause an individual to uh, absorb shame so deeply that it becomes a part of their very nature. But it's usually a thematic unit, like abandonment. Abandonment in general gives you a low self-esteem, as in you're rejected by the world, either by your parents, mostly in childhood trauma, by some sort of authority figure, school teacher, your peers. Something in your formative years that causes you to feel abandonment will cause an ever encroaching development of that sense of shame. But also, obviously, more heinous acts like abuse of various sorts, which is also a form of rejection by the world. If you're abused by, say, a sibling or a parent, it's the same thing. You put trust towards something, and that something causes you pain. It's rejecting you in this fashion. And the base of the pyramid is basically that. It's a collection of the disparate ways that shame can grow within an individual. Most of it actually occurring within childhood, but it definitely can grow a bit in later life, though I guess in childhood would be the most commonplace. But the multitude of causes all accumulates into the same phenomenon ultimately, that deeply, deeply ingrained sense of self-worthlessness. And that's ultimately what I think shame manifests in when you try to verbalize it. It's a sense of internal worthlessness, like the world has rejected you. It has sent you a message. You're not worth anything. Now you have to somehow manage that state of affairs. And it won't be that you necessarily feel ashamed of yourself because you may have a lot of reasons to be proud of yourself for achievements that you've accomplished, which in actuality, if you have that deeply rooted sense of shame, odds are good you are going to, well, manifest that shame in a variety of manner, which is how we get to the second part of the pyramid, how we get to the inverted image of it, how it expands outwards from the point, is that the top of the pyramid is wide as well, and the top constitutes all the different compensation mechanisms that are possible to develop as a consequence of that deeply rooted shame. So some people will compensate through perfectionism, for example. They might get really, really good at one thing or many things in order to justify their existence, in order to prove to the world that they are actually worth something. Now, that sort of compensation as a mechanism is more on the healthier side. It's still a compensation. So it can go into that pathological direction of it where you feel nothing you do is good enough, even though the quality of work you're putting out is absolutely excellent. I think a lot of artists suffer from perfectionism. And I think the calling to become an artist, like a musician, for example, is heavily rooted in shame, actually. I remember watching a documentary on Tom Petty. This documentary was about 4 hours long. And I watched it basically just out of interest, because I do music as well. But there was a segment of that documentary that really connected. It connected these pieces related to shame. And the scene was set that there was an interview conducted with one of the A&R people from one of the record labels that Tom Petty encountered when he was about 18 years old. So he went, I think it was to California, yeah, California, LA, I don't know, like one of these major hubs for music production. He went there as an 18-year-old and he started basically harassing the labels to try and get him a contract. He came with his songs and with his demo tape, just looking for a record deal. And the A&R guy that was being interviewed, he recalls meeting Tom Petty when he was 18 years old and listening to his music, and he thought to himself, this kid has some pretty good songs. His mother must be dead. And that comment from the A&R guy about the dead mother was like kind of out of nowhere. But then he goes on to explain, it's like, yeah, it's basically a stereotype. If there's a young man that's good at music, dead mother. Almost 100% of the time, dead mother. And with Tom Petty, I think it was something like that. It was either his mother died or abandoned him or something in that manner. But nonetheless, it explains that sense of rejection because a death of a parent is not interpreted by a child as, something understandable that it wasn't your fault. I mean, a 3-year-old doesn't understand that the death of a parent, them disappearing from one day to another, is somehow not their fault. I mean, they blame themselves for everything. So that would make a lot of sense why one mechanism of compensation for that deeply rooted shame is actually pursuit of excellence and pursuit of excellence in the arts as a method of, I guess, resolving oneself against this internal conflict that you don't even know is necessarily going on. But there's definitely unhealthy ways of manifesting shame as well. I mean, people succumb to drug use, they succumb to drinking. Many women succumb to basically promiscuity. And it's all rooted in the same phenomenon. It's all rooted in shame, and it's just a different compensatory mechanism. So Tom Petty's excellence in music is rooted in the same causal element as all these bar sluts basically putting out on the first date. And understanding this hourglass of shame phenomenon, I think, is very useful in looking at people and assessing them of who they are. Like, you want to get to know people that you need to interact with on a regular basis, like a business partner, a romantic partner, friends and things like that. And understanding people is complicated because people are complicated. However, shame seems to be so universal within the human condition that if you look at a person and their behavior as fundamentally being a collection of mechanisms to compensate for their internal shame, people actually make a lot more sense than they would otherwise. And I found this to be a very useful mechanism for assessing people. And so ultimately, you're not judging them for possessing this element of shame. What you're doing is you're assessing as to whether or not their specific compensatory mechanisms are something that you want anything to do with. As in, if they're unhealthy, if this specific person, does drugs, that might not be a mechanism you want to have to deal with. But if somebody else, for example, a musician pursues the arts and is a perfectionist, that's not a problem whose compensatory mechanism is going to cause any problems in your life. So they're definitely worth dealing with. And when I've adapted this way of actually looking at people as trying to sense out internally whether or not they are governed by shame. And like I said, most people seem to be. It seems to be fairly universal these days. And I'm going to say that it's becoming more and more so the case because of social media's influence. And it's going to become even worse once AI takes the scene. Because another way of actually developing shame is having a sense of incompetence. And the way a lot of kids have been raised is that their parents were fundamentally helicopter parents. So they would do the thinking for their kids. They would perform all the trivial decisions. You know, when they go out to a restaurant, the parents would decide what the kid's going to eat. And so the child never really develops this muscle for making decisions. And they become sort of habituated to become reliant on a third party to make decisions for them. And then somebody like that is cut off from their source of decision making, like when a kid goes into the real world after living a life where their parents have made every decision for them, and they start having to make these decisions on their own. Now, what happens with such a kid? He's going to feel insecure about his own choices because he's not used to making them. So, why would he feel confident that he is competently making these choices? And he won't. And I've met a lot of kids like this, people that are completely paralyzed to make a choice based on the most trivial of matters. They'll look to someone to defer the decision to. And people are going to do this to themselves more and more so with the use of AI. Now, AI acts exactly like this, like a helicopter parent, like ChatGPT, where you defer your thinking fundamentally to a third party. And with enough repetition, you're going to lose confidence in your own memory and your own ability to assess a situation or to recall something. You're basically going to lose trust in yourself, which is exactly what these helicopter parents do to their kids. So people are going to impose that sort of phenomenon on themselves and cultivate that sense of inner shame. And they will embody it and then compensate either through, well, those that will use AI will continue to use AI, but it'll manifest in other forms as well. So this is this is one of those curious insights that when you start applying it against a lot of behavior that we say talk about, say male female dynamics, like women being promiscuous and going to clubs. Now, the hypothesis from the PUA scene is that those guys, the PUAs, have a certain skill set that makes them effective at pulling girls to bring back home. Now, my hypothesis is that the girls at the clubs are the Johns in the situation. The girls at the clubs are, in essence, soliciting prostitutes, not the other way around. The way to understand this is that the women want validation when they go to the club. So they're soliciting a prostitute for that validation, the prostitute being basically the guys at the bar, except the dynamic is the man's supposed to approach. So if a PUA approaches, the woman is already buying. Now, the rest of his job is to just not be a complete moron in how he approaches and to just feed her need for validation, to tell her what she wants to hear, because that's what she's going to pay for with sex ultimately at the end of the night. And these girls that are promiscuous in this manner are definitely doing it from a sense of shame. They want the validation, they want the reinforcement, and they have developed now promiscuity as their compensatory mechanism. And not every girl uses promiscuity to compensate for shame. I've seen, by contemporary standards, fairly normal, quote unquote, normal girls that don't go to clubs, they don't drink, they don't they're not promiscuous, but yet at the same time they have a mechanism that serves the same function as promiscuity. And one of the things I've noticed is overachievement. And a lot of these girls who are overachievers are ultimately just compensating for that inner sense of shame. So they've gone down a path which seems healthy topically, but is ultimately still rooted in the same base problem. So when interacting with these people, if you start from the premise that this person has that inner sense of shame, let's figure out what their mechanism is and judge the mechanisms if they're on the healthy side or the sick side, and then make a decision on how we want to proceed with that person. It's not a bad system of interacting with people, especially women, because again, most women seem to have that inner sense of shame, very, very well cultivated, very well cultivated. And you might want to avoid the cutters. You might want to go for the girls that are overachievers. But ultimately, it's the same root problem. And if you understand that, you'll know that ultimately both the overachiever and the promiscuous girl, the cutter, the drinker, the druggie, are searching for acceptance from the world, validation by the world. And any guy who can issue that validation is going to be somebody who they might want to interact with. And it's the same thing for guys. Guys manifest also through overachievement at work, through being arrogant. Narcissism is ultimately um, probably the extreme manifestation of compensation against shame, is that the person has now created a completely fictitious world around themselves and a perception of themselves to guard themselves against this shame. So internally, they feel completely worthless. Externally, they present themselves as being, you know, the most important creature who has ever existed. And I think that that spectrum of compensation is fairly wide, but narcissism is probably like the gold standard for when you're really, really internally sick. You're going to end up developing this narcissistic personality because that's the only defense mechanism you have for yourself. And shame, like I said earlier, is probably, like, I'm convinced it's the most powerful of human emotions, because suicide is something that is one solution to that inner sense of shame. And it's those people who cannot figure out another mechanism to defend themselves against that inner pain, um, resort to something like that, which is tragic, but it is a solution, I suppose. So yeah, hope this has been interesting. Thanks for listening. Go team.